I'm using a new smart ring technology, so I need to make sure I'm careful when I shake somebody's hand that they don't advance my slides to the end of the presentation. Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. As our MC said, I'm very passionate about the topic of sustainability, and I think this is a great country really to talk about this particular concept, particularly to an IT audience. I think we're in a very interesting point in time. We're at an inflection point where data is exponentially exploding. We create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data on a daily basis. That's 1 with 18 zeros. And just to give you kind of an idea of how much data we're creating, we've created more data in the last 2 years than in all of human history. And this is exponentially increasing. We are converting our analog world to a digital one, and it's largely fueled by what is often referred to in ecological terms as the IPAT equation. This is the impact of an ecosystem is largely dependent upon the size of the population multiplied by affluence multiplied by technology. One could argue whether or not we have or want to have any influence over the first two parts of that equation, but we certainly have control over the third part, the technology component. And I think that's why we're in a unique position in this industry to help drive change from a sustainability perspective. Currently, 10% of the world's electricity is consumed by the IT infrastructure. In the typical data center environment, we see 60% on average over provisioning. If you think about those moments in time that maybe a retailer needs to actually provision for Black Friday, right? And then they've got all that excess capacity the rest of the year. So this is a huge issue. This is resulting in approximately $30 billion in wasted capital on an annual basis. And all of this has environmental impact. About a third of the what we would call embedded carbon in sustainability terms, or the environmental impacts associated with enterprise IT equipment, are upstream. It has to do with the extraction of materials, the manufacture and assembly of those products, the energy going into the production processes at that upstream end. And why is this important? Well, it also has global social implications. Most of the minerals that go into IT, as well as things like consumer goods like smartphones and other products, come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They call them the 3 T's and G, tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. They fueled huge illegal wars back in the late 1990s to the early 2000s, resulting in 5 million deaths of people in the Congo. So there's social implications as well as environmental implications when it comes to these issues. So governments are now responding. The EU has come out with what they're calling the EU Green Deal. It's actually this framework's going to be launched in early March. And it has, as a component of that, what they call the Circular Economy Action Plan. Only 9% of the materials, the raw materials that are extracted from the Earth's crust, actually make their way back into the circle. That's a really small number. So we really need to think about how do we expand that number. I was talking to some sharp young guys last night over a great Icelandic beer from Open Kyrfi. Ironically, they actually have a beer at their booth here today too. So I encourage you to stop by them. And they asked, what's your perspective? I do a lot of travel around the world. What's your perspective of where Iceland is in terms of sustainability along that journey? And I said, I think this country's in a really unique position because I actually think you have the huge opportunity to define what sustainability means for you, for your government, for business, as well as civil society. And I think everyone here has a potential role to play in that. We're increasingly seeing partnerships formed that are advancing this concept. And then I've heard here in terms of conversations I've had with people, well, the younger generation cares about it, but the older one doesn't. Well, trust me, if my 78-year-old conservative Republican father, if I can convince him about sustainability and the value of it, I think anyone can be convinced about the value of it, particularly the business value of it. So when we think about sustainability in terms of large IT infrastructure, I often talk about it in terms of three concepts, 3 buckets, if you will. One is equipment efficiency, doing the most amount of work with the least amount of equipment. And advances in things like hyperconverged technology are great examples of moving toward doing more with less. The second one being energy efficiency. How do you maximize the amount of work done on a particular processor, for instance? And then finally, resource efficiency. What are those resources, both from an infrastructure standpoint, as well as one not to be ignored, human resources that go into maintaining IT infrastructure? And it's that last component, human resources, that's often the most difficult to move people along in their digital transformation journey. And I think many of you would probably agree with that. But you can't manage what you don't measure. So one of the things that we've actually done at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, it was an employee, a colleague of mine in Switzerland, realized and recognized the fact that projections were pretty significant. That by 2035, half of all the energy produced in Switzerland, and similar to Iceland, they have a lot of hydro, you guys have a lot of geothermal here, but half of all the energy produced will actually be consumed by data centers in data center-friendly hosting countries such as Iceland, Ireland, Sweden, and others. So it's a huge issue to consider. But again, you can't manage what you don't measure. So what we've done is data center efficiency has largely been measured over the course of the last 3 decades by a measurement that many of you are probably familiar with called the PUE, or power usage effectiveness. This essentially means it's a ratio of the amount of energy going into the data center, how much goes to the IT equipment versus how much goes to sort of the peripheral support, cooling, lighting, things of that nature. But it doesn't take into account what's the energy supply. Is it a green energy supply? What are you doing with waste heat? Do you have the ability to potentially recycle waste heat? And most importantly, from my perspective, is efficiency of the workloads. Is we're moving from workloads that are more basic workloads to workloads that are machine-driven, AI-driven. One of the analogies I often use, it's like saying, I have the most energy-efficient washing machine and dryer on the planet, but when I use it, I put 1 sock in it, right? So you have to measure the usage of the workload and the types of workloads that are going into that particular infrastructure. So what we've done is we've created a new green data center label, and that's open sourced. If you're interested in it, you can look it up. You can contact us at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. And the government of Switzerland, the canton of Geneva, has actually adopted this as their minimum standard for all new data centers in the canton. And it's going to spread throughout Switzerland, hopefully throughout the EU, Iceland, and other places. So it takes into consideration these other factors. And then one of, I think, the most interesting and potential largest opportunities in terms of sustainability is a pivot of business models. And we've talked about it with a number of the partners that I've met here over the last couple of days, but it's this shift to offering everything as a service. It's no longer about ownership, but it's about access. And even if I take my HPE or even computer hat off for a minute, there's companies that are doing some really innovative and interesting things. Like, for instance, Philips, the lighting company from the Netherlands, they had a spin-off called Signify, and they're offering lighting as a service. Suddenly, the company focus is not on how many light bulbs I sell, but how could I design that light bulb for maximum life? How can I design it for repairability? And how do I deliver maximum outcome from a lighting perspective for the clients? At HPE, we've committed to offering everything we sell as a service. We call it Green Lake by the end of 2022. And I'm really excited about it because I believe that the shift to as a service is a way to drastically reduce overconsumption and over-provisioning. We can provide metering and monitoring and spin up infrastructure when it's needed, spin it down when it's not, to match it to the customer's needs, and then they're only paying for what they use. So I think not just in IT, but across the board, there's some really cool examples of this shift to access over ownership. And then clearly, advancements in innovation are going to be required to really create a more sustainable future, and some really cool examples that are coming out of Hewlett Packard Labs right now. You've all heard, of course, about edge computing. IDC predicts that by the end of 2023, 75% of all the data created will be created at the edge. And the edge is anywhere outside of the data center. This is the smart factory floor. This is where the customer is interacting on the retail floor. This could be, in an autonomous vehicle. any number of locations, but where latency is an issue, performance is an issue, and you're not going to be able to, when you're running down the street at 100 kilometers per hour and someone jumps in front of your car, you don't have time to decide whether or not that latency is an issue, going back to the cloud to make that decision of whether or not your car should stop or turn. So applications like this, for instance. So that's a big one. It also takes an order of magnitude more energy to move data to where the compute is than to process the data itself. So if you can actually move compute out to the edge where these use cases are occurring and then save centralized cloud and data center locations for other operations that could be timed more efficiently, you're increasing efficiency on a huge scale. Also, memory-driven computing, another innovation coming out of Hewlett Packard Labs right now. For the last 60 years or so, compute architecture has remained relatively the same, where you have a processor and small pools of memory tethered to those processors. And what we've done is we've flipped that inside out, where you have large pools of memory that any processor can access, any processor within the infrastructure. During certain periods of time, 90% of the work is actually asking sort of the mother may I questions. May I access your memory? May I access this memory between storage and processors and other pools of memory? Memory-driven computing eliminates this by flipping it inside out and having that large pool of memory at the center and agnostic chips around the outside. And then exascale computing. We're applying some of that memory-driven computing technology to exascale computing. And just to give you an idea, many of you, of course, are probably familiar, but we're talking about exascale computers are processing 1 billion transactions a second. Some of these systems require about 30 megawatts of power just to actually operate. So huge amounts of energy. And in order to do this sustainably, we're going to need to think about how to do it differently. And then a couple of use cases of these technologies. One that we're working with a company called ABB in Germany with is this convergence of OT and IT in edge computing. Nearly 45% of all the world's energy goes through electric motors. I had no idea about this until I talked to my friends at ABB and looked it up and verified it, and it's actually true. It's a huge amount of energy that's used, mostly in manufacturing and production processes. Well, you can obviously mount very sensitive sensors to some of this equipment and determine potential failures and then bring it offline, do a quick repair, and easily bring it back online, creating huge efficiencies around materials, energy, and other factors, production processes. So very cool stuff happening there. We also work with a few companies that are generating wind power with large wind turbines. They can detect subtle vibrations in the blades, and we can actually bring those systems offline and repair those before there's a catastrophic failure. Another one, which is something that's both important to me and one that I think really hits home. I'm from California. Many of you probably heard about the huge fires a couple of years ago. 20,000 structures were burned, most of them homes. 100 people died, in one of the most developed places on Earth, all because of winds and power lines. So one of the things we've done is we've combined forces with CenterPoint Energy, where we're actually building an intelligent grid, sensors in the grid where you can determine where potential failures can occur and often fix these before they actually result in failure. And then a really cool example of the use of memory-driven computing. There's a research institute called DZNE. They're looking for a cure for Alzheimer's disease. And what they've done is they're looking across huge data sets that they've had for decades. 3 decades of epidemiological studies, now comparing that to human genomic maps, and they just haven't had the power that they've needed to run some of these correlations. But we've increased the speed of that for them by 100% at just a fraction of the energy. So an example of the use of something like memory-driven computing to advance the way people live and work. And then finally, this is, I guess, my soapbox. I travel around the world. I get the opportunity to meet a lot of great people. Some of them think about issues of sustainability and others don't. But what I would say is kind of my call to action. It's really up to all of us, whether you're in procurement, whether you're a data center manager, whether you're in government, whether you're in academia. I think we all really need to think about how do we apply these principles to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Not all companies are as large as ours or are lucky enough to have a chief sustainability officer or a team to do some of this work, but we all have the ability, I think, to make a difference. So I'd encourage you to take a look within your own business models, what you're doing for your customers. Obviously, we're all trying to increase value for our customers, reduce time to value, but we need to do it in a sustainable way. And I think you guys here in Iceland have a really unique opportunity to define what sustainability means for your future. Thank you.